Before there was an Eden, there was a Dilmun. Before a serpent tempted a woman under a forbidden tree, before angels stood guard with flaming swords at a garden's gate, before humanity's oldest storytellers ever dreamed of paradise lost, the people of Sumer were already dreaming of paradise found. They called it Dilmun, a land where the sun climbs out of the sea each morning, newborn and blazing, a land where the raven does not croak, where the lion does not kill, where the wolf does not snatch the lamb, a land where sickness does not touch the old, where the widow does not weep, and where no one, not one single soul, ever says the words, "I am sick." It sat somewhere at the edge of the world the Sumerians knew, out past the mouth of the two rivers, where the sun broke the horizon over the waters of the Gulf. And for over 2,000 years, long before Genesis was written down, long before the word paradise existed in any language, the scribes of Mesopotamia were already carving this vision into wet clay. A garden without death, a land without pain, a place where the gods themselves had chosen to make their home. This is the story of that place, not the trading post, not the island kingdom of merchants and copper ships we explored before. This is Dilmun as the ancient mind actually experienced it, not as a market, but as a myth, not as a destination on a map, but as a destination for the soul. This is the story of where the sun rises, and where, if the old poets are to be believed, humanity briefly touched eternity. To understand why the Sumerians needed Dilmun, you first have to understand the world they were trying to escape. Mesopotamia was not a gentle land. The very name means the land between the rivers, and those rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were unpredictable, violent, and utterly indifferent to the people who depended on them. Some years the floods came too early, drowning the barley before it could be harvested. Other years they came too late, and the canals ran dry, and the earth cracked into a face of dust. The Sumerians built the first cities in human history along these riverbanks, and with those cities came the first written laws, the first epic poems, the first schools, the first taxes, and the first sustained recorded human anxiety about mortality. Nowhere else in the ancient Near East do we find such an intense, almost obsessive preoccupation with death as we find in Sumerian and later Babylonian literature. Their gods were not comforting. They were not the benevolent architects of a well-ordered universe. The Mesopotamian gods squabbled, schemed, grew bored, grew angry, and on at least one occasion in myth decided that humanity had simply become too loud and drowned nearly all of it in a flood. The Sumerians did not imagine an afterlife of reward. Their underworld, a shadowy realm called Kur, or later, in Akkadian, Urkala, was not a place of punishment for the wicked and comfort for the just. It was simply where everyone went, kings and slaves, priests and thieves, down into the dust, to eat clay and drink from puddles, forever. This is the world that produced Dilmun. If your afterlife was a dim, dusty warehouse where the dead shuffled around forever eating dirt, you needed somewhere else to place your hope. You needed a counter-myth, a place that existed not after death, but instead of it. A place where the ordinary rules, sickness, old age, predation, grief, simply did not apply. That is what Dilmun became. Not a heaven you go to when you die. A paradise that exists right now, somewhere just past the edge of the known world, untouched by the curse that fell on everywhere else. And the direction mattered. In nearly every culture that has ever told a story about a lost golden age or a hidden perfect land, geography carries meaning. For the Sumerians, living in the flat, hazy floodplain of southern Iraq, the sun did not rise over mountains or over neighboring cities. It rose, as far as they could tell, directly out of the waters of the Gulf, out of the same waters that, if you sailed far enough, eventually brought you to the shores of Dilmun. So Dilmun became, quite literally, the place where the sun was born each day, the point of first light, the eastern threshold of the world, standing just outside the reach of the grave. Keep that image in mind, because it is the key that unlocks almost everything else in this story. Dilmun is paradise not because it is far away and unreachable, like some distant heaven bolted to the sky. Dilmun is paradise because it is at the beginning. It is where each new day is born. And in a civilization terrified of endings, a land defined entirely by beginning was the most sacred place imaginable. If you want to meet Dilmun as paradise, you have to start with one specific poem, inscribed on clay tablets that were later excavated at the ancient city of Nippur, and now sit, fragmented and painstakingly reassembled, in museums in Philadelphia and elsewhere. Scholars call it Enki and Ninhursag, though it has also been given the more evocative title, The Affairs of the Water God, or simply, Paradise. It opens, and this is one of the most famous opening passages in all of Sumerian literature, with a description of Dilmun so strange, so specific, that it reads less like a myth and more like a checklist of everything that was wrong with the real world, systematically negated one item at a time. The land of Dilmun is pure, the land of Dilmun is clean, the poem tells us. And then it begins to explain exactly what that purity looks like, in the most grounded, almost domestic terms imaginable. In Dilmun, the raven does not croak, doesn't caw, doesn't make its usual ominous sound, because in the ancient Near East, the raven's cry was an omen, a herald of death and misfortune. Take away the raven's croak, and you take away the very sound of bad news. In Dilmun, the darbird, a kind of francolin, a game bird, does not utter its own distinctive cry. The lion does not kill, the wolf does not snatch the lamb, the dog does not know how to make baby goats curl up in fear. There is no predation here, no fear echoing across the food chain. It is a description of nature with its violence surgically removed. The poem continues, and its focus shifts from the animal kingdom to something even more intimate, human suffering itself. The pig does not know that grain is scattered, so there's no theft, apparently, not even among animals. Then, most strikingly, the widow does not spread malt on the roof for drying, because the wild birds do not eat it up, meaning there is no scarcity, no loss, nothing to steal from a grieving woman's meager stores. The dove does not tuck its head under its wing, a small, precise image of an untroubled bird sleeping in peace rather than hiding from a hawk. And then the poem arrives at its most devastating lines, the ones that scholars return to again and again when they talk about why this text matters so much for understanding ancient conceptions of mortality. No eye disease says I am eye disease. No headache says I am headache. No old woman says I am an old woman. No old man says I am an old man. The young girl does not wash in her impure water in the city. The man who is drunk does not. And here the tablet damages, and scholars have debated the missing verbs, but the sense is clear even in the gaps. In Dilmun, decay does not announce itself. Illness has no voice. Old age has no name. The specific afflictions that every single person listening to this poem, a farmer in Nippur, a scribe in a priestess in Uruk, would have feared in their own bones, are, one by one, stripped away and declared simply absent. This is not a vague poetic gesture toward a nice place. This is the ancient Mesopotamian mind constructing, piece by careful piece, the precise negative image of everything it was afraid of. Every curse of human existence, predation, theft, hunger, sickness, aging, grief, is named specifically, and specifically denied entry into Dilmun. Historians of religion have a term for this kind of paradise description. It is sometimes called a negative utopia in construction, not negative in tone, but negative in method, a paradise defined by systematically subtracting every known evil from the world, rather than by describing positive delights. And it is worth pausing on how radical this is. This is arguably the oldest surviving literary attempt in human history to define perfection by naming, one at a time, exactly what perfection is not burdened by. But Dilmun in this poem is not simply an empty, sanitized landscape. It is inhabited, and its first inhabitant, its founding resident, is one of the most important gods in the entire Sumerian pantheon, Enki. To understand why Dilmun became paradise, you need to understand the god who claimed it first. Enki, later known to the Babylonians as Ea, was the Sumerian god of the Abzu, the primeval body of fresh water believed to lie beneath the earth. He was the god of wisdom, of craft, of magic, and crucially, of the sweet, life-giving water that made agriculture possible in an otherwise punishing landscape. If the sky god An ruled the heavens in distant abstraction, and the storm god Enlil ruled the earth with terrifying, unpredictable force, Enki was something different, a clever, resourceful, deeply engaged god, one who actually seemed to like humanity, who intervened in the world, who solved problems, who in more than one myth outright saved human civilization from divine anger through sheer ingenuity. In Enki and Ninhursag, it is Enki who looks upon the pure, clean, but essentially dry and lifeless land of Dilmun and decides to remedy its one flaw. The poem tells us that Dilmun's port is good, but it has no water in its canals, so the crops cannot grow. So Enki calls out to the sun god Utu and asks him to bring fresh water up from the earth, to fill Dilmun's wells and channels with sweet water flowing straight from the Abzu itself, the primordial freshwater ocean that Enki himself commands, and Utu grants the request. Suddenly, the poem tells us, Dilmun's fields and furrows produce grain. Its city becomes a place that drinks fresh water from the earth. Its wells of bitter water become wells of sweet water. The barns fill with barley. Dilmun becomes a great port, a warehouse, a cave for the land. Notice what has just happened in the mythic logic of this text. Dilmun begins the poem as pure but sterile, a paradise on the level of the absence of evil, but not yet a paradise of active abundance. It takes the direct intervention of Enki, the god of life-giving fresh water, to transform it from a merely clean land into a truly flourishing one. Purity alone is not enough to make paradise. Purity has to be joined with fertility, with divine favor made manifest as water flowing through the desert. This mattered enormously to an audience of farmers whose entire civilization depended on irrigation. When they imagined the perfect land, they didn't imagine gold falling from the sky or endless feasting halls. They imagined working canals. They imagined wells that never ran dry. They imagined the single resource whose absence could kill an entire city in a single bad season, made permanently, divinely abundant. And having made Dilmun fertile, Enki does something else. He makes it home. The god of wisdom and sweet water essentially retires there, or at least establishes it as his sacred, favored territory, the place where he himself resides alongside his consort. Later Mesopotamian tradition consistently describes Enki's dwelling as being connected to, or located at, Dilmun, sometimes described as sitting at the very mouth of the two rivers, the place where fresh water meets salt water, where the Tigris and Euphrates system empties into the Gulf. That image, the meeting point of sweet water and salt water, was not incidental. In Sumerian cosmology, this confluence was considered a place of enormous cosmic significance, almost a seam in the fabric of creation itself, where the ordered, fresh, life-giving waters of the Abzu touched the older, wilder waters of the sea. Enki, god of the Abzu, naturally belonged at exactly this threshold, and so did paradise. But the poem Enki and Ninhursag isn't really a poem about geography or irrigation at its core. It's a strange, sprawling, often uncomfortable myth about desire, birth, disease, and healing, and Dilmun is simply the stage on which all of it plays out. Here is where the story gets strange, even by the standards of ancient mythology, and it's worth walking through it carefully, because the details reveal exactly how the Sumerians understood the relationship between paradise, fertility, and mortality. After establishing Dilmun as a fertile, flourishing land, Enki turns his attention to Ninhursag, one of the great mother goddesses of the Sumerian pantheon, sometimes called Lady of the Mountain, or associated with the earth and with birth itself. What follows is a sequence of unions and births that modern readers often find genuinely unsettling. Enki fathers a daughter with Ninhursag, then in successive episodes fathers further daughters with each new daughter in turn, each birth occurring, remarkably, after only 9 days of pregnancy rather than 9 months, as though the text wants to emphasize that time itself moves differently, more generously, in this paradise. Each daughter that is born is instantly, impossibly, of marriageable age. Eventually, the pattern reaches a goddess named Utu, a deity associated with weaving and plants. Utu, wary after hearing what has happened to the daughters before her, refuses Enki's advances unless he brings her proper marriage gifts, cucumbers, apples, and grapes. Enki, ever resourceful, has Utu the sun god bring water to make these very things grow, gets them, brings them to Utu, and the union proceeds regardless. But this time, something different happens. When Enki's seed is placed inside Utu, Ninhursag, perhaps finally intervening on behalf of her lineage of daughters, removes it from Utu's body and plants it in the earth. From that planted seed, 8 different plants spring up from the ground of Dilmun. Among them, plants later identified with things like the wood plant, the honey plant, the vegetable plant, and others whose exact botanical identities scholars still debate. Enki, seeing these unfamiliar new plants growing in his paradise, decides, in a moment of pure divine curiosity, or perhaps arrogance, that he must know what they are. So he has his vizier and messenger, the god Izamud, pluck each plant, and Enki eats them, one after another, determining their nature by literally consuming them. This act of consumption is his undoing. Ninhursag, enraged that Enki has eaten what were, in a sense, her own descendants transformed into plant form, curses him. She pronounces the words, "Until he is dead, I will not look upon him with the eye of life." And then she vanishes from among the gods entirely, disappearing so completely that even the other deities cannot find her. And Enki begins to die. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but organ by organ. The text lists, with the same careful, almost bureaucratic precision as the earlier catalogue of Dilmun's perfections, the parts of Enki's body that begin to fail. His mouth, his tooth, his rib, and several others sicken, one by one, as the poison of the 8 plants he consumed works through him. The great god of wisdom, the architect of Dilmun's fertility, lies dying in the very paradise he created. The other gods panic. The fox, in a comic aside that many scholars find genuinely charming amid the tension of the narrative, offers to go find Ninhursag and bring her back, in exchange for a reward, and successfully persuades her, or perhaps is credited with locating her so that she returns to help the dying god. When Ninhursag comes back, she does not simply forgive Enki, she heals him with the same precision with which she cursed him. She asks him, one by one, which part of his body hurts, and for each ailing part, she creates a new deity whose birth corresponds to and cures that specific affliction. When his rib hurts, she creates the goddess Ninti, whose name means, remarkably, both Lady of the Rib and Lady who makes live, a pun in Sumerian that some scholars have long connected, with real scholarly caution but genuine fascination, to the later biblical story of Eve being formed from Adam's rib in the Genesis account of Eden. One by one, Ninhursag births a deity for each of Enki's 8 failing organs, and one by one, Enki is restored, healed completely, brought back from the edge of death, in the very land that had been declared, at the poem's opening, a place where sickness itself supposedly had no name. This is worth sitting with, because it complicates the simple picture of Dilmun as an untouchable, static utopia. Even in paradise, the myth suggests, transgression is possible. Even the god who made the land fertile can suffer, can nearly die, can require healing. Dilmun is not a place where the possibility of harm has been erased from the universe entirely. It is a place where harm, when it does occur, is always, eventually, met and undone by an equal and opposite act of divine restoration. Sickness in Dilmun is answered not by prevention alone, but by the guaranteed presence of healing. Some scholars have read this myth as, among other things, an origin story explaining the mythological or symbolic roots of certain deities and plants important to Mesopotamian medicine and agriculture, a kind of divine pharmacology, encoded in narrative form. Others read it as a meditation on desire and consequence, on the tension between insatiable curiosity. Enki simply had to know what those plants were, and the natural limits the world places on consumption, even divine consumption. But for our purposes, the crucial takeaway is this. This myth cements Dilmun, once and for all, as the primary sacred landscape of Sumerian religion, the place where gods are born, where gods marry, where gods sicken, and where gods are healed. It is not simply a pleasant location mentioned in passing. It is the stage of divine biography itself, the place where the fundamental processes of Sumerian cosmology, creation, fertility, sickness, and restoration are worked out in mythic time. If Enki and Ninhursag establishes Dilmun as the home of the gods, it is a very different, and in many ways even more famous, story that establishes Dilmun as the place where at least one mortal human managed, against every law of nature and divine order, to cheat death completely. That story is the flood narrative, one of the oldest and most influential stories in the history of human literature, predating the biblical account of Noah by well over 1,000 years, and surviving today in multiple overlapping versions across Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian literature. In the oldest Sumerian version, the flood hero is a king named Ziusudra, whose name is generally translated as something like Life of Long Days, or He Who Found Life of Distant Days, a name that is, quite literally, a prophecy of what is about to happen to him. In the later, more famous Babylonian versions, incorporated into both an independent flood tablet tradition and, most famously, into the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero's name becomes Utnapishtim, meaning he found life, or in an older Akkadian form, Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. The broad shape of the story will be familiar to anyone who knows the Noah story from Genesis, and that familiarity is not a coincidence. Most scholars of comparative religion consider the Mesopotamian flood narratives to be, in some form, ancestral to, or at minimum, deeply influential upon the later Hebrew account. The gods, in various versions of the myth, decide to destroy humanity, sometimes because human noise and overpopulation has disturbed the sleep of the great god Enlil, a wonderfully petty and human motivation for a near apocalypse. Enki, once again playing his role as humanity's ally among the gods, secretly warns one righteous, favored mortal of the coming catastrophe, instructing him to build a boat, load it with his family, with craftsmen, with the seed of every living creature, and to seal it against the coming deluge. The storm comes, it rages for days, it is so terrible that even the gods themselves are said to cower, frightened by the violence of what they have unleashed, huddling together and weeping at the destruction of their own creation. When the storm finally breaks, and the boat comes to rest, and the hero releases birds to find land, we reach the moment that concerns us here directly. In the Epic of Gilgamesh's telling, inscribed on the 11th tablet of that great epic, in a passage that is, itself, an embedded retelling of the older Sumerian and Akkadian flood stories, the god Enlil, moved by the flood hero's piety and by Enki's intercession on his behalf, does something that no god had ever done for a mortal before, and that the text is careful to tell us no god will ever do again. Enlil takes Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand, brings them before the assembly of the gods, touches their foreheads, and blesses them, declaring, "In the past, Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife shall become like us gods." And then Enlil pronounces the fateful sentence, "Utnapishtim shall dwell far away, at the mouth of the rivers." That location, the mouth of the rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the sea, is precisely the location so consistently associated with Dilmun throughout Sumerian and Babylonian tradition. Later versions of the story make the identification explicit, naming Dilmun directly as the place of Utnapishtim's eternal exile, or rather, his eternal reward. Utnapishtim does not die. He is not simply granted a long life, the way certain other legendary kings in the Sumerian king lists are credited with implausibly long reigns. He is granted actual, literal, permanent immortality, and he is relocated, body and soul, to Dilmun to live it out, forever separated from the rest of humanity, forever beyond the reach of the underworld that claims every other human being who has ever lived or will ever live. This is the detail that later inspires Gilgamesh's entire desperate journey. In the epic that bears his name, Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man by the story's own mathematics, and utterly terrified by the death of his beloved companion Enkidu, sets out on an almost impossibly difficult quest across mountains, through the realm of scorpion men, through a tunnel of absolute darkness that the sun itself travels each night, and across a sea of death guarded by a stone-handed ferryman, all in pursuit of a single goal, to find Utnapishtim, the one human being who ever achieved immortality, and to learn the secret of how he did it. When Gilgamesh finally reaches him, and reaches Dilmun, the place where he lives, Utnapishtim's answer is, in some ways, the emotional and philosophical center of the entire epic. He tells Gilgamesh, essentially, that his own immortality was not earned. It was not achieved through strength, or wisdom, or even virtue in any conventional sense. It was granted once, in an unrepeatable circumstance, by a unique convergence of divine politics and Enki's clever intervention. He asks Gilgamesh, pointedly, which of the gods will convene the divine assembly on your behalf, so that you too might find the life you are seeking? And the clear implication is, none of them. It will never happen again. Utnapishtim then, somewhat reluctantly, offers Gilgamesh two chances at something lesser than true immortality. First, a test, Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, and perhaps you will prove yourself capable of resisting the sleep that so resembles death. Gilgamesh fails almost immediately, falling asleep within moments of sitting down, a brutal, almost cruelly comic demonstration that even the greatest hero alive cannot outlast something as simple and universal as fatigue, let alone death itself. Then, out of what reads as genuine pity, Utnapishtim's wife convinces him to give Gilgamesh a consolation gift, a plant, a thorny plant growing at the bottom of the cosmic sea, which, while it does not grant immortality, grants renewed youth to whoever eats it. Gilgamesh dives, retrieves it, and rejoices, thinking he can at least bring this gift of renewal back to the elders of his own city of Uruk. And then, in one of the most quietly devastating moments in all of ancient literature, on his journey home, while he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water, a snake slithers up, smells the plant's fragrance, and steals it, sloughing its own skin as it slithers away, gaining the very renewal that was meant for Gilgamesh, who is left sitting by the pool and weeping. Gilgamesh returns home to Uruk with nothing but the walls of his city to show for his journey, walls which, the epic tells us in its closing lines, are themselves a kind of immortality, not the immortality of the body, but the immortality of what a person builds, what endures after them. Now, why does any of this belong in a story about Dilmun? Because this is the single most important literary function Dilmun ever performs in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian mythology. It is not simply described as a nice place. It is established, through the most famous story the ancient Near East ever told, as the one and only place in the entire universe where a human being managed to escape death. Every single person who ever heard the Epic of Gilgamesh recited, whether in a royal court, a temple courtyard, or scratched onto a schoolboy's practice tablet in a scribal academy, heard, embedded within it, this same message: somewhere out past the horizon, at the mouth of the rivers, where the sun comes up each morning, there exists a real place where one of us actually made it, where death was, at least once, defeated. That is an extraordinarily powerful idea for a civilization as thoroughly, relentlessly preoccupied with mortality as ancient Mesopotamia was. Dilmun becomes, in effect, proof of concept, not a vague hope, not an abstract afterlife, a specific, geographically locatable, narratively verified exception to the universal rule of death, inhabited, right now, by a real historical mythical figure whom later kings would sometimes even claim descent from. Let's return to that image from the opening of this script, because it deserves deeper unpacking. The idea of Dilmun as the place where the sun rises. In the cosmology reflected across Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the world was understood, broadly, as a flat disk of land surrounded by a cosmic ocean, with the heavens forming a solid dome or vault above it, and with a corresponding body of fresh primordial water, the Abzu, Enki's domain, lying beneath the earth. The sun god, Utu in Sumerian, Shamash in Akkadian, was believed to travel across the sky by day, watching over justice and truth. Utu Shamash was, among his other roles, the god of law and oaths, the all-seeing witness to human affairs, and then, each night, to travel back through the underworld, through darkness, re-emerging each morning in the east. Multiple texts place the sun's daily emergence specifically at or near Dilmun, sometimes describing gates or specific cosmic doorways through which Utu passes at dawn. Dilmun's eastern, maritime position, genuinely, in real geography, roughly southeast of the Mesopotamian heartland, out toward the Gulf, mapped almost perfectly onto this mythic geography of first light. It made intuitive, poetic sense. The direction from which the life-giving sun is born each day is also the direction where paradise and eternal life and the god's own preferred dwelling place would naturally be found. This eastward orientation carries enormous symbolic weight that echoes across cultures far beyond Mesopotamia. East, across an extraordinary range of human religious traditions, is consistently associated with birth, renewal, and beginnings, while West is consistently associated with death, ending, and the underworld, because, quite simply, that is exactly what the sun itself does every single day, dying in the West each evening and being reborn in the East each morning. Ancient Egyptian religion built an entire elaborate theology around this same solar logic, with the west bank of the Nile reserved for the dead and their tombs, and the eastern bank reserved for the living and their temples to the rising sun. It would be an overstatement to say Mesopotamia and Egypt shared identical cosmologies. They developed largely independently. But the underlying human logic connecting sunrise to rebirth and sunset to death appears to be something close to a universal instinct, and Mesopotamia's placement of its paradise squarely in the direction of sunrise fits comfortably within that broader pattern. There is something worth dwelling on here about what it must have meant, practically, for a Sumerian farmer or priest to look east each morning. This wasn't an abstract theological point confined to temple libraries. It was reinforced daily, physically, by the most basic and universal human experience there is, watching the sun come up. Every single sunrise, for every person in Mesopotamia, was a small, repeated confirmation of the myth. Yes, life returns. Yes, the darkness ends. Yes, somewhere out there, past where I can see, is the source of all this renewal. Dilmun, in this sense, was never entirely a fictional elsewhere. The way, say, a distant heaven beyond the stars might feel abstract and unreachable. It was tied every single day to an observable, universal, undeniable natural event. The sun really did rise in the general direction where Dilmun was believed to sit. That gave the myth a kind of daily, lived credibility that pure fantasy could never achieve. Myths do not exist in a vacuum. They get used by kings, by priests, by institutions to justify power, to explain legitimacy, to build identity. Dilmun's paradise mythology was no exception, and some of the most fascinating evidence for how seriously this mythology was taken comes not from poetry, but from royal inscriptions and administrative texts. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian kings, across many centuries, were deeply invested in tracing connections, sometimes genealogical, sometimes purely symbolic, to figures and places associated with the deepest, most sacred layers of their mythic past. Flood heroes like Ziusudra and his descendants occupy a special liminal position in the ancient Sumerian king list, that remarkable document which attempts to catalog, with perfectly straight-faced administrative precision, the reigns of kings both before and after the flood swept over the land, including kings, before the flood, credited with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, itself another expression of that same cultural yearning for a lost age when mortality's grip was looser. Certain later rulers, particularly during periods of Mesopotamian history when direct trade contact with the historical Persian Gulf region of Dilmun was strong, especially in the 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE, took real political and religious interest in associating themselves with Dilmun's sacred prestige, dedicating offerings to Enki in his role as Dilmun's patron, and referencing the land and royal building inscriptions with clear reverence, not merely as a trading partner, but as a place of genuine cosmic importance. This dual identity, Dilmun the real, physically visited trading kingdom of the Gulf, alongside Dilmun the mythic paradise at the edge of the cosmos, is one of the most fascinating features of the whole tradition, and it's worth pausing to really sit with how unusual this is. Most paradise myths in world religion are explicitly set apart from ordinary accessible geography. Eden, in the Genesis account, is guarded and sealed off after the expulsion, its location made permanently inaccessible. The Greek Elysian fields exist in a realm reached only through death. But Dilmun's mythic paradise and Dilmun's historical trading kingdom occupied, as far as the ancient sources are concerned, the very same name, and quite possibly, in the minds of many ordinary Mesopotamians, the very same place. Imagine what that must have meant, practically, to a merchant loading a boat with grain and wool at a Mesopotamian port, preparing for a real voyage across the Gulf. He was not simply sailing toward a business opportunity. In the deepest cultural imagination of his civilization, he was sailing in the general direction of the land where the gods made their home, where the first sunrise occurred each day, where a single human being had once achieved eternal life. Trade with Dilmun carried, whether consciously articulated or not, a residue of sacred significance that trade with, say, the Indus Valley cities further east, a region the Mesopotamians also had documented contact with, apparently did not carry in the same mythologically loaded way. This blending of real and mythic geography likely served real political functions too. A king who could claim particularly close ties to Dilmun, through successful trade, through temple dedications, through poetic praise, was implicitly claiming a kind of proximity to the sacred, to Enki's favor, to the closest thing his civilization had to the source of eternal life itself. It would be impossible to tell this story honestly without addressing the question that hovers over almost every modern discussion of Dilmun. Is this the origin of the Garden of Eden? The honest scholarly answer is careful, layered, and more interesting than a simple yes or no. Let's start with what can be said with real confidence. The broader literary and religious world of ancient Mesopotamia demonstrably shaped the world in which the Hebrew Bible was composed and compiled. The flood narrative in Genesis shares such specific structural and narrative details with the Mesopotamian flood traditions: the divine warning to a single righteous man, the construction of a boat, the loading of animals, the sending out of birds to test for dry land, the eventual divine blessing of the flood survivor, that the vast majority of scholars of ancient Near Eastern religion consider some form of literary or oral relationship between these traditions to be effectively certain, even if the exact mechanism of transmission across the centuries remains debated. The Babylonian exile of the Judean elite in the 6th century BCE, when Jewish scholars, priests, and scribes lived for decades in direct proximity to Babylonian literature, temples, and scribal schools, is frequently cited as one plausible, though certainly not the only possible, channel through which this shared literary heritage could have deepened. Given that connection, it is entirely reasonable to ask whether Eden itself, as a concept, a primordial, divinely planted garden of abundance, located somewhere at the world's edge, associated with rivers, and ultimately placed off-limits to ordinary humanity, owes something to the older Mesopotamian tradition of Dilmun. There are genuinely striking points of resemblance. Both are described in terms of extraordinary natural abundance and divine cultivation. Both are associated with rivers. The Genesis account of Eden famously describes a single river flowing out of the garden and dividing into 4 separate rivers, including named waterways that many scholars have long connected, at least symbolically, to the Tigris and Euphrates river system, the very heartland of Mesopotamian civilization. Both traditions link this paradisiacal land to a divine plant with power over life and death, in Eden, of course, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the Dilmun tradition, both the mysterious 8 plants that Enki consumes in Enki and Ninhursag, and separately, the plant of rejuvenation that Utnapishtim's wife directs Gilgamesh toward, only for it to be lost to the serpent. And that detail alone, a snake, specifically, that intercepts and steals access to a plant of renewed life or youth, right at the very moment a human is about to benefit from it, is one of the more startling points of resonance between these traditions, given how central the serpent is to the entire Eden narrative in Genesis. And then there is that linguistic curiosity mentioned earlier. The goddess Ninti, Lady of the Rib and Lady who makes live, born from Enki's ailing rib in the Dilmun myth, bears a resemblance, again, one that serious scholars raise with real caution, not as a settled certainty, to the far later account of Eve, whose name in Hebrew tradition is connected to the concept of life, and who is formed, in Genesis, from Adam's rib. But here is where responsible scholarship insists on real caution, and it's worth being just as honest about the limits of this comparison as about its genuine points of interest. These are not identical stories. Eden, in the biblical account, is fundamentally a story about human disobedience, about the loss of an original innocent state through a specific moral transgression, and about the resulting expulsion of humanity from paradise as a form of divine punishment that then defines the human condition going forward: labor, pain in childbirth, and mortality, all following directly from that expulsion. Dilmun's mythology carries a genuinely different theological weight. Dilmun is never described as a paradise that humanity as a whole once possessed and then lost through sin. It is, instead, consistently described as a place that belongs primarily to the gods, with only one single exceptional human being, Utnapishtim, granted immortality through a unique, unrepeatable act of divine favor, ever actually residing there. There is no Mesopotamian equivalent to the idea that all of humanity once lived in this paradise and was collectively expelled from it. So the most responsible way to describe the relationship is this: Dilmun almost certainly represents part of the deep cultural and literary soil from which later Near Eastern paradise traditions, including Eden, eventually grew, sharing imagery, motifs, and perhaps even specific narrative fragments, transmitted and transformed across centuries and across cultures in contact with one another. But Dilmun is not simply Eden under a different name. It is its own distinct mythological structure, serving its own distinct theological purposes within its own civilization, and deserving to be understood first and foremost on its own terms, rather than purely as a precursor to a later, more famous story. Widen the lens a bit further, and Dilmun takes its place within an even broader, genuinely global pattern in human religious imagination, the idea of a blessed land, often an island, often located toward the rising sun or across a great body of water, reserved for the exceptionally favored dead or for the exceptionally favored living. Ancient Greek mythology offers a particularly close structural parallel in the concept of the Isles of the Blessed, sometimes called the Elysian Fields, a paradise reserved, in the version recorded by the poet Hesiod, not for all the dead, but specifically for a particular generation of heroes who are granted a life free of sorrow at what Hesiod describes as the edges of the earth, near the stream of deep swirling ocean. Note the resemblance to Dilmun's core structure. Not a paradise for everyone, but a paradise for the exceptional, located at the edge of the known world, associated with a great cosmic body of water. Celtic mythology offers its own version in the concept of Tír na nÓg, the land of youth, an otherworldly island paradise located across the western sea, where time moves differently, where those who dwell there do not age, reachable only by those specifically invited by its supernatural inhabitants. Even later Islamic and Persian traditions of paradise gardens, while theologically distinct in crucial ways, carry forward some of this same deep, ancient regional emphasis on gardens, rivers, and abundance as the defining features of ultimate reward. A continuity of imagery across thousands of years and multiple religious transformations in the very same broader Near Eastern cultural region where Dilmun mythology first flourished. What seems to unite all of these traditions, across cultures that in most cases had no direct contact with one another, is something close to a fundamental structure of human hope. The conviction that somewhere, past the edge of the map, across the water, toward the sunrise, there exists an exception to the ordinary rules, a place spared from decay. And crucially, in nearly every one of these traditions, that place is not equally available to everyone. It is reserved for the exceptional, the favored, the specially chosen, a detail that speaks perhaps to something uncomfortable but very human, the difficulty of imagining universal salvation, and the persistent cultural habit, instead of imagining salvation as a scarce, earned or granted privilege. Dilmun stands as one of the very oldest, most fully developed expressions of this pattern that survives in written form anywhere in the world. When modern scholars trace the deep roots of the entire, sprawling, cross-cultural human tradition of imagined paradise, the garden at the world's edge, the land where death has no power, Dilmun is very often where that trail runs coldest, at the very origin point of recorded literature itself. It's worth returning briefly to solid ground, because the mythology of Dilmun did not develop in a vacuum. It developed alongside, and in dialogue with, genuine, verifiable historical geography. Modern archaeology has firmly identified the historical territory of Dilmun with the region encompassing the modern nation of Bahrain, along with parts of the adjacent Arabian coastline and, in various periods, the island of Failaka off the coast of modern Kuwait. Excavations, particularly the extensive work carried out on Bahrain since the mid-20th century, have uncovered an extraordinary density of burial mounds, tens of thousands of them, some individual, some collective, some monumental in scale, dating across many centuries of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, along with the remains of temple complexes, most famously the temple identified at Barbar on Bahrain, believed by many archaeologists to have been dedicated to Enki himself, built directly over a natural freshwater spring, a detail that resonates powerfully with Enki's mythic role as the god who filled Dilmun's wells with sweet water. This freshwater detail deserves particular attention because it represents one of the clearest points where myth and physical geography line up in a genuinely striking way. Bahrain, unusually for an arid region surrounded by the salty waters of the Gulf, sits atop natural freshwater aquifers, historically producing freshwater springs that in some cases actually bubbled up through the seabed itself, creating pockets of drinkable fresh water within the surrounding salt sea. An almost unbelievable natural phenomenon that ancient sailors and traders would certainly have known about and marveled at. It is not difficult to imagine how such a place, an island where fresh, sweet water miraculously emerges in the middle of the salt sea, could become, in the religious imagination of a civilization that revered fresh water as sacred and scarce, powerful evidence of genuine divine favor, direct physical confirmation that this really was the special, blessed dwelling place of Enki, Lord of Sweet Waters. The archaeological picture supports the idea that Dilmun's real historical prosperity and prominence, grounded in genuine lucrative trade connections linking Mesopotamia, the Gulf, and the Indus Valley civilization to the east, explored in detail in the previous chapter of this series, likely reinforced and amplified its mythological prestige rather than existing as some separate, unrelated track. A place that was already, in real historical experience, wealthy, prosperous, blessed with impossible freshwater abundance in the middle of the sea, and positioned at the far eastern edge of the known trading world, was primed, almost inevitably, to also become the place the imagination reached for when trying to picture paradise. Step back now and ask the larger question this entire series has been circling. Why does any of this matter? Why should a modern audience, thousands of years removed from cuneiform tablets and Sumerian irrigation canals, care about a half-forgotten paradise myth from the edge of the ancient Gulf? The answer, I think, is this. Dilmun offers an unusually clear window into the very earliest layer of a psychological and spiritual pattern that has never actually left human civilization. The impulse behind Dilmun, the need to imagine, somewhere just past the horizon, a place exempt from the rules that govern the rest of existence, is the same impulse that produced Eden, that produced Elysium, that produced Tir na Nog, that produced in later centuries every subsequent vision of heaven, utopia, or lost golden age that human beings have ever constructed. We are, apparently, a species that cannot fully accept the finality of the world as it is, and that has been building imaginative exceptions to that world for as long as we have had the tools to write our imaginings down. What makes Dilmun especially valuable, from a historical vantage point, is precisely how old and how well documented it is. We are not reconstructing this paradise myth from fragments, guesswork, or later, second-hand references. We have the actual poem, Enki and Ninhursag, recorded on tablets from one of humanity's oldest cities. We have the flood narrative, recorded across multiple independent textual traditions spanning well over 1,000 years of transmission and adaptation, culminating in the towering literary achievement of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have royal inscriptions, administrative trade records, and physical archaeological remains that let us watch, with unusual clarity, the exact moment where real historical geography and sacred mythological imagination overlapped and reinforced one another. And perhaps most movingly, we have that opening catalog from Enki and Ninhursag, the raven that does not croak, the widow who does not weep, the old woman who does not say, "I am an old woman," which remains, 4,000 years later, one of the most emotionally direct and universally comprehensible descriptions of paradise ever composed. You do not need to understand Sumerian theology, or Sumerian irrigation practices, or Sumerian royal politics to feel the force of those lines. You only need to have ever feared sickness, loss, or the slow erosion of age, which is to say, you only need to be human. That is the real, enduring legacy of Dilmun. Long after the historical kingdom faded from prominence, long after its ports fell silent and its temples crumbled into the sand of Bahrain, the underlying human need it once answered never went away. Every subsequent civilization in this part of the world, and arguably every civilization anywhere, would go on to build its own version of the same idea, a place where the sun rises new each day, where the widow does not weep, where death, for once, does not get the final word. Somewhere at the bottom of the Gulf, beneath waters that Sumerian sailors once crossed with cargoes of copper and wool, the freshwater springs that once fed the temple at Barber still, in some places, bubble up through the salt sea, exactly as they did 4,000 years ago. The ravens of the region still croak, of course. The old still grow old, and the widow still grieves. The myth, in the end, did not change the world it was written against, but it changed something else. It gave the people who first told it a way to hold their fear of death at arm's length, if only for the length of a poem. It gave them a direction to look, east, toward the sunrise, toward the place where their god of wisdom made his home, where one favored human being had once, against every law of the universe, simply refused to die. We still do this. We still tell each other stories about gardens at the world's edge, about places spared from decay, about doors that might somehow stay open just a little longer than they should. We call them different names now: heaven, paradise, utopia, the good place. But if you trace the story back far enough, back past Eden, back past Elysium, back to the very first clay tablets ever pressed by a Sumerian scribe's stylus, you arrive again and again at the same place: a pure land, a clean land, a land at the mouth of the rivers, where the sun climbs fresh out of the sea each morning, and where just once, in one unrepeatable act of divine mercy, death itself was made to wait outside the gate. Dilmun, where the sun rises,